Well, did 1953 coup influence 1979 Islamic Revolution? If it did, how? What was the mechanism?
Well, I think the mechanics is that the regime in 1979 collapsed so spectacularly. No one outside Iran expected it to collapse because the Shah had such a huge military force. He had substantial funds, oil revenue. The regime seemed impregnable in 1978-79. Yet after a few months of demonstrations, the whole thing collapsed. So this posed really a historical question, why such a spectacular collapse? And in answer to that, you have some weird theories about if it was a foreign conspiracy, or it was the Americans or the British or the Russians that conspired to bring down the regime. None of this really is borne out by the confidential diplomatic documents that have come out. In fact, what is striking, once you read the British and American documents, is how the British and American embassies were actually taken by surprise and really didn't know what to do during the upheaval. And they were as surprised as anyone else by what happened in the collapse. I think the answer to why the regime collapsed really goes back to 1953. Because what 1953 did, the coup did, was that it delegitimized the monarchy. And you could see this actually before the coup in the discussions about whether to have a coup or not. From early on during the Mossadegh administration, there were the British and some people in the CIA who were already talking in May of 1951 of the Shah carrying out a coup. And the Shah was very resistant to carrying out a coup. And he was very consistent. He constantly told the foreign ambassadors that he could not carry out a coup because if he went against Mossadegh, if he went against oil nationalization, he would delegitimize his monarchy and the whole monarchy in Iran. And he basically went against British and American advice. And he continued to argue along these lines all through 1952, early 53. It's not until really quite late in the day, just before August of 53, that he begins to shift on the great American and British pressure, and he decides to participate in the coup. In fact, he's blackmailed in carrying out the coup or participating in the coup by the fact that the Americans tell him that they're going to go along with the coup whether he's on board or not. And if he's not on board, there's no guarantee that he will still be on the throne after the coup. In fact, the Shah had two brothers at that time who were dangling to replace him. And he knew perfectly well that there was the danger that if he didn't go along with the coup, if the coup succeeded, one of his brothers would succeed as Shah. So it was this type of blackmail that got him to actually participate in the coup. And I think here what this shows is the Shah was much more perceptive, much more savvy, much more in tune with Iranian public opinion at that time than the foreign ambassadors or his advisors. He realized that nationalization and Mossadegh really represented nationalism in Iran. And if he went against nationalism, he would delegitimize himself. He would appear as a force against the nationalization, against the Iranian nationalism, against oil nationalization, which was really the Iranian form of getting independence, sovereignty from former colonial powers. And in that context, it was the Shah actually, I think, was much more aware of the importance of the whole issue of nationalization and Mossadegh, and was quite careful enough or resistant enough to oppose the participation in the coup. And having participated in the coup, he realized he had greatly delegitimized the monarchy. And from then on, what he often did, and various political somersaults of the Shah, was trying to actually regain some form of legitimacy, to replace the fact that he had gone, was seen as an imperial colonial puppet that had been imposed on Iran. So he did various basically political actions to try to get a substitute form of legitimacy to bolster the regime. And this, I think, in a way, he was politically shrewd enough for him to realize that he needed some form of legitimacy or regaining of legitimacy. But unfortunately for him, the things he did to get legitimacy further undermined his position. So over the years, basically, his actions to get legitimacy ended up actually alienating more people and losing more of his little legitimacy he had. So by the 1970s, when he had only a few minor problems, economic problems, there weren't major problems. There was a question of human rights and torture in prisons. Most regimes could have survived without having to resort to torture. But this regime collapsed because it really lacked legitimacy. And you can see this in the American and the British documents in 1978 on the eve of the revolution, where the ambassadors say the Shah has trouble negotiating with anyone in the opposition because no one in the opposition really considers him legitimate. So the question of legitimacy, I think, is at the core of really the problem of the Shah and the revolution. So if you want to, I could go into the types of things he did to try to get legitimacy, but which were actually counterproductive and further alienated him. But that's an additional issue about his lack of support by 1978.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Oh, yes. I mean, the military, the Shah had support among young officers, especially tank officers. They were very carefully selected, actually, after 1941, when the British came into Iran. They were already very careful in monitoring the military. And it's later on the myth came that, of course, the CIA came in after 1953 and did work on the military. But the British actually, from 1941, were keeping a very close tabs on the military. And any officer they suspected of being leftist or nationalist was often basically marginalized to the provinces. And the key officers at that time to carry out a coup were tank officers. And so the tank officers, especially in Tehran, were especially selected as young officers who had been trained in and sent off to the United States to be trained with Sherman tanks and modern tanks. So the Shah did have a considerable amount of support among that type of the military. And that was, of course, one factor that permitted the CIA and MI6 to carry out a coup. They knew who were the tank officers and who they could rely on to do that. So the Army officer corps, yes, that was, I would say the Shah had support there. And that continued to be true, I think, through the reign. The Shah cultivated carefully his support in the military. But you can't really run a country with army officers. You need a large army, rank and file. And the Shah, again, here was, I think, shrewd enough during the demonstrations of 1977-78 that he couldn't ask really his rank and file to shoot into civilian crowds. The shooting that was often done was done by officers, not rank and file, because they were worried that if they asked ordinary soldiers to do that, they would either mutiny or defect or even use their rifles against their officers. So during the revolution, there was a great myth about 60,000 people being killed in the streets. This is grossly exaggerated. The violence in the streets was, of course, important, but it was actually more like 600 people killed in the demonstrations rather than 60,000. And here you can see the military officers. You can say they still relied or were supportive of the Shah, but army officers could not have really bolstered up the regime in 1979. It was not like a Pinochet type of army, highly disciplined, with ordinary soldiers willing to obey senior officers. So I think here again, the Shah was savvy enough to know that when people talked about, well, use force, carry out a bloodshed and everything will return to normal, he realized this could not be done because he didn't have that type of military. He could order that to the officer corps to do it, but they would not be able to actually control the whole country. And this also comes clearly in General Heuser, who the American high office, the general who was sent by President Carter to investigate the situation in Iran to see if there was a possibility of carrying out a coup. And his answer really was that, sure, the military imperial guards could take over important key positions, such as, let's say, the staff headquarters, the prime minister's office. But when it came to actually controlling the whole country, especially the oil industry, mass communications, the bazaars, the army could not do that. So the possibility of carrying out a successful coup was nil in 1979. So it wasn't the Shah really being weak-minded and not carrying out a coup. It was not a realistic option that he had in 1978 or 79. And every time the force was used, such as in Jaleh Square, it actually was counterproductive. It created more opposition, a general strike, and it intensified the opposition rather than intimidated the opposition.
Thank you, sir. My next question, could the revolution happen if Mossadegh hadn't been overthrown?
Well, I'm sort of shy of ifs in history. History, we know what happened, and then we try to answer why it happened the way it happened. when you say sort of fictitious alternatives, if Mossadegh had survived, many things could have happened. I mean, he may have been able to create a liberal democracy, or he may have had to face tribal revolts, especially from the Bakhtiaris, Qashqais. All possibilities were there. What we do know is that in 1953, he was prime minister. The regime, the administration was quite secure. In fact, you can see this in the CIA reports that Mossadegh's administration was quite secure, and that the coup replaced him and brought to power something that the Iranian public considered a puppet of the American administration. So that we know. But when you go in to speculate about if this had not happened or something else had happened, you're opening a Pandora's box of all sorts of alternatives.
Thank you. Could the coup take place without the Shah's consent?
It's interesting because when they were discussing having a coup, this was 52, 51, the Americans were consistent that to have a successful coup, you had to have the Shah's participation. Why? Because they knew the Shah had personal support among the younger officers, and they couldn't really find any officer that could carry out that role. So the officers they looked at, Zahedi, for instance, Zahedi presented himself as a great leader with a great deal of influence in the military, and that he was willing, he had the capabilities of carrying out a coup. But the CIA, once they looked at the situation, they realized that Zahedi was in fact bluffing. And Zahedi's support was predominantly among retired officers. And you can't carry out a coup with retired officers. You need active commissioned officers in the field, and Zahedi didn't have any of that. So it's possible, you know, if the Shah had refused to participate, they would have carried out a coup. But whether, in fact, any of the brothers could have played that role is not, not likely. The brothers did not have that type of prestige or following, personal following among younger officers. So it could have been a much more messier coup, attempted coup. And in fact, for the young officers who carried out the coup, the fact that there was a Shah's signature dismissing Mossadegh, that gave them some legitimacy, which if the signature wasn't there, it would have been very much harder for the CIA to have pulled off the coup.
Thank you. Some believe that regardless of the decisions and actions of Shah of Iran, the revolution was inevitable. They think that we were in the period of revolutions, for example. Do you agree?
Well, I would say it was inevitable, but it wasn't because of sort of international wave of revolutions. I think it goes back to question the regime in Iran lacked legitimacy. So even a small, basically, pressure was enough for it to basically unravel. And the two pressures that came in 1976, 77, 78, 76, 77, early 78, the two pressures were fairly minor pressures, but they were enough to bring down the whole house of cards. One pressure was a slight dip in oil revenues. So one could say, there was the economic crisis, but it really was not a crisis because it was a dip in revenues. It wasn't a drastic decline. Iran still had large reserves. The Shah could still have borrowed a lot of money from abroad if needed be. So the economic argument really doesn't explain it. The other argument that's often made, it was Carter's human rights pressure that unraveled the situation. There was human rights pressure. It was basically limited to that the Shah, that the Savak should be more careful about use of torture in prisons, and that political opponents should be taken to civilian courts, not military courts. These were two, so you could say, small reforms the Shah did. But again, to say that the regime unraveled just because the secret police couldn't use torture and that political prisoners had to go to civilian courts was enough to unravel the system. It shows how weak the system was, that it unraveled because of that.
Yes, thank you. Can we say that the coup brought us under the domination of US and the attack on the US embassy under the domination of Russia? Are they, let's say, comparable to each other?
No, because I don't think the Soviets really had any role about the attack on the US embassy. That was basically for them as much as a surprise as for anyone else. I think that was an internal issue, and I think that was much more to do with internal Iranian politics. At that time, the Khomeini supporters wanted to get their constitution, Islamic constitution, approved, and it was useful to have a national crisis then. And once the students broke into the embassy, I think the Khomeini circle made full use of that, created a national crisis to get the constitution approved through a referendum. I don't think the Russians were basically watched the situation. They might have enjoyed it, but they certainly were not really controlling or participating in the crisis.
Thank you. And I have a question about the influence of actors of a coup. Can you sort the influence of actors, I mean the foreign actors, the Shah himself, and also Kashani and other opponents of Dr. Mossadegh?
Yes, I think, the main argument, of course, when you say the CIA coup, the main argument is, well, Iranians were also involved. It couldn't have been just done by Americans. And of course, it's true. For instance, the Chagukeshan down in Tehran were not Americans masquerading as Chagukeshan. The tank officers who brought in some 40 tanks into Tehran were not Americans pretending to be Iranians. So clearly, Iranians were involved. Basically, the question is, could the coup have succeeded without the MI6 and the CIA, because they coordinated and put into action the coup? The Iranians who played their important role were, of course, I would say, predominantly the army officers, because it was a military coup. At the bottom of it, bottom line was a military coup, and a military coup meant tank officers in 1953. And there again, the Iranians played a role, but they wouldn't have played a role without here British actually participation. The British were more important. MI6 was far more important than the CIA. Where the crucial link came was for the MI6 to know which army officers, tank officers, especially in the brigades, the 5 brigades around Tehran, which army officers they could rely on. And they knew how to find these officers because, as I mentioned before, they'd been working in Iran since 1942. And the Iranian G2, which is the army security, had worked closely with MI6 since 1942. And the person who was crucial here was Colonel Akhavi, who had at one time been at the head of the G2. He knew the army officers, and he actually, in August of '53, could give the Shah actually names of 40 officers who were willing to participate in the coup. He knew them. He, as a G2 commander, he could vouch for them. But the British also had worked with him, so they had the records and knew who the army officers were. The American CIA had never really compiled such archives or files. And it's interesting, one lesson the CIA learned because of the coup, and right after the coup, 3 months after the coup, Donald Wilbur, who had participated in the coup, was assigned the task by the CIA to write a book on the coup as a handbook on how to carry out a successful coup. One thing he said had to be learned was to have records on military officers. The term he uses, what makes each officer tick, who are their friends, who are their opponents, what are their interests. And this the CIA had not had. The British had it. The CIA did not have it. So after that, I presume this is what the CIA did with the military officers. But at the time of the coup, the CIA not having it, they had to rely on Colonel Akhavi and the MI6 to carry out the coup. And in fact, here, the British MI6 has got a raw deal because they actually played a more important role in this than it's usually considered. And of course, they're not allowed to boast about it or talk about it. So often people in MI6 who knew what happened feel that their participation, their importance in the so-called success has been ignored or has been negated because without that information, the coup could not have succeeded. Now, where the clergy played a role, of course, it's very controversial, especially Kashani. I don't find any evidence of Kashani actually participating in the coup itself on Mr. Hashem Mordad. Not because he would not have supported the coup, it's probably because the CIA and the British didn't trust him enough to do that, and they didn't need Kashani to participate in the coup. And the new documents actually are quite honest. They show that the money that was used for the crowd, so-called crowd in Mr. Hashem Mordad, the money was funneled through Ayatollah Behbahani, not Kashani, so that they were able to short-circuit Kashani and carry out the coup without Kashani knowing about it. Where Kashani played a role was not in the coup itself, but in the months before the coup, in trying to undermine Mossadegh in the Majlis. And here again, the new documents showed that Henderson was often in long communications, in interviews, private interviews with Kashani, basically buttering up Kashani as a great, not Iranian leader, a great Muslim leader, and playing on his ego. And this was then transferred into Kashani, in fact, playing an opposition role to Mossadegh in the Majlis, in the 17th Majlis. And of course, it was the difficulties Mossadegh had in the 17th Majlis that eventually led to the referendum, and Mossadegh using extra constitutional methods to end the jammed log in the Majlis and trying to get legislation passed. So Kashani's role was, in fact, negative, but it wasn't in the coup itself. It was, in a way, a long-range way of undermining Mossadegh. And so the clerics who were close to Behbahani and Kashani did play that role of trying to undermine Mossadegh. But it's often forgotten that there were actually plenty of other clerics who supported Mossadegh, continued to support Mossadegh, and even supported Mossadegh after the coup. So Talagani was not the only person. There were plenty of others, even in the Majlis. There were a number of clerics, especially from Tabriz, who supported Mossadegh to the very end. So the argument that the coup was a clerical a conspiracy, and the clerics played the crucial role, not the military. It's basically a fake history. It's trying to distract from the actual coup itself, which was a military coup. And the Behbahani and the crowd really provided acoustical effects in the street. They were immaterial for the actual coup itself.
Okay, thank you very much. In your book, A History of Modern Iran, you talk about secular forces. My question is that in addition to the illegitimacy of the regime after the coup, what was the effect of removing the secular forces on the revolution?
Well, of course, after the coup, the Shah systematically dismantled secular opposition, not only the two-day, but the National Front. So these organizations that could have been able to articulate opposition to the regime were dismantled. So the only organization you can say that was left in the country was one, the bazaars, and two, the mosques. They weren't, you could say, rigidly organized, but there was an informal network of clerics in the mosques and the bazaar. And of course, the Shah was not able to dismantle such a, you could say, embedded organizations. But there's something else that I think is important. The coup delegitimized not only the monarchy, it also, in a way, indirectly delegitimized the Mashrutiyat, the constitution. Because until then, the idea of the constitutional revolution, constitution, rule of law had been the primary discourse in Iranian politics. And the coup, in a way, showed the weakness, the failure of the constitution. So that when the crisis comes in 78, 79, the idea of a constitution does not resonate as legitimacy. There is no harking back nostalgia for Mashrutiyat any more than there is for monarchy or constitutional monarchy. So I think that delegitimization goes beyond the monarchy. It goes, in fact, to what had been in the past in Iran, which was the Mashrutiyat. And you can see this in the 1960s, 70s already. The discourse shifts, especially with Shariati, away from constitutionalism, of borrowing from the West, from the notion of the Enlightenment, which had been very important in Iranian history, towards the question of Gharb Zadegi, and anything from the West must be suspect, including liberalism, constitution, rule of law, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So I think the costs of the coup were far-reaching than it's usually thought.
Thanks, sir. Can relying on the model of Mocdaq, on the pattern of his behavior in Iran today, be a unity among the critical forces, except the monarchists, or except the person who are around the Pahlavi?
Yes, I mean, I think the attraction of Mossadegh is not just a question of nationalism, secularism. It's also the notion, again, back to the ideas of the Enlightenment, because Mossadegh was very much a child of the Enlightenment. So if there is a return to Mossadegh's type of politics, in a way it's a return to pre-1960s politics of bringing back the discourse of rule of law, individual rights, and separation of religion and from politics. So Mossadegh, in a way, is a symbol of what had been very predominant in Iranian politics from really 1900 to 1960s, which is the discourse of the Enlightenment. If I may also actually slightly digress, the question of legitimacy. When 53 destroyed the legitimacy of the monarchy, the constitution, and then with Gharb Zadegi, the legitimacy of the West, legitimacy of the Enlightenment, you get a vacuum in question of legitimacy. In any society, you have to have some reason why you obey, why you listen to laws, you basically accept authority. And when there is a vacuum, and here Max Weber, I think, is very relevant, when there's a vacuum, when old forms of legitimacy have been shattered or no longer effective, and new forms of legitimacy like rational bureaucratic order has not been established, when you have a vacuum, that's when Max Weber says you have the emergence of charismatic figures. Charismatic figures are not just something within the leader, but they basically appear in a context of a vacuum of legitimacy. So that for Max Weber, charismatic figures are people that appear in Old Testament Bible figures, the prophets, who say, well, the customs tells you this, tradition tells you this, the past tells you this, but I, as a leader, tell you something else. And what I tell you is the truth, not what was done in the past. And this, I think, more than anything else, explains the emergence of Khomeini's charisma, that he became the new, basically, form of authority, not because his own personality, but because there was a vacuum in the system of legitimacy. And he was then the figure who was going to establish the new form of legitimacy. And that became his interpretation of the Islamic Republic.
Okay, thanks. Before my final question, I have a question about the revolution. Do you believe the revolution came through if the military didn't surrender?
Well, the fact that they surrendered was really the last, basically, finishing. By then, the revolution had been accomplished. There was nothing really the military could do. As I think General Heuser noted, the generals could order certain things, but doesn't mean they could control the whole country. So they were facing reality, basically, when they gave up in the last stages. There was little they could do. The reality was that the revolution had already succeeded. And we forget that, in fact, many provincial towns had already been taken over by the opposition by February 1979. So what could the army do? And the army at that time basically was the Imperial Guards. They could walk in and take over the prime minister's office, but they could even take over, let's say, the chief of staff offices in Tehran. They could even take over the telegraph and telephone offices. But how are they going to control the whole of the railway system, the whole of the oil industry, the whole of the bazaars, the millions of people who were opposed to them? So the military, I would say, is basically had abdicated before its overt abdication on February the 12th of 79.
Thanks. And my final question, what is the lesson of Mossadegh's rule for Iranians today?
But Mossadegh was not in the business of executing people. And of course, that's the appeal for him. He was basically a man of law and order and the Constitution. I think the lesson, I would say the lesson, I would say the relevance of Mossadegh to the present is the relevance of the constitutional order and the ideas of individual liberty. And that those are the relevant themes of contemporary Iranian politics. And this is what, of course, both the royalists and the Islamic Republic is fearful of, because once you leave the individual to have their choices and view their rights as something that comes from nature, not from divinity, that undermines the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic and of traditional authority. So I think that's why Mossadegh still, I think, resonates among young people, and that it's not so much the lessons to be learned, but what he stood for, and what he stood for is still relevant in 2022.